All right, so as the situation over in Ukraine continues to spiral, President Vladimir Putin of Russia came out and basically raised the stakes to the maximum extent possible by essentially floating out the idea that his nuclear arsenal is on the table right now. So here from Common Dreams, Kenny Stansel, just to start us off here, he says, unacceptable and reckless, Putin puts Russian nuclear forces on special alert. So he says Russian President Vladimir Putin was condemned on Sunday after ordering his military to put its nuclear forces on special alert, and the move made in response to what Putin calls aggressive statements by members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, makes it easier to launch nuclear weapons more quickly, though it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia intends to use them. And they say, according to BBC security correspondent Gordon Carrera, Putin is likely trying to deter NATO support for Ukraine by creating fears over how far he is willing to go and creating ambiguity over what kind of support for Ukraine he will consider too much. So you kind of understand what Putin's games are right now. It's not that he's floating out the idea of immediately launching a first strike nuclear attack on some NATO country. It's more so that he's trying to use the fact that he is a nuclear armed, dictatorial superpower. He's trying to leverage that in order to extract concessions and maybe tamper down the ability for Western aligned or NATO countries to funnel weapons into Ukraine, because the facts of the matter is, if you've been paying attention to what's been going on the ground, the Russian all-out offensive has been significantly stalled by Ukrainian defensive security forces as well as civilians who have just taken up arms. So it seems like Russia, although they still have not committed the maximum extent of their military power, it seems like they thought that this was going to be a lot easier than it ended up being. And so they're now trying to use the threat of nuclear weapons to basically raise those stakes even further and try to basically tell the West that if you guys, cross any boundaries, or if you, maybe even the types of weapons that we have been supplying them, if you continue to do this, then everything is on the table, right? So it's mostly just a threat and posturing, but it's posturing in basically the most dangerous way we could possibly imagine. So just to reiterate that point of exactly what type of threats he's making here, they say Kremlin warns against supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine. So Russia's foreign minister said that the countries supporting Ukraine with lethal weapons would bear responsibility if they are used during Moscow's ongoing offensive. So again, using kind of ambiguous and vague language to maybe sort of imply that Western countries that are helping out Ukraine with weapons and ammunitions that, I don't know, maybe will float this idea of using nukes against countries out there. It's basically mostly seems to be just a fear tactic, but again, one that would have just unimaginably catastrophic consequences. So we're going to get to what the responses recently have been from the West and the types of things that Putin may even consider to be an act of war. We're basically right up on the border of what he has in the past stated would be a declaration of war in terms of our sanctions and weapon supplies being funneled into Ukraine. But first, just another update on how some of these stakes have been getting raised by Putin. They say Belarus is now going to apparently host Russian nukes in their territory. So Belarus is the country that Russia was doing large military exercises leading up to the invasion. They have a dictator named Lukashenko who is essentially, works in lockstep with everything that Putin wants. And they basically just put forward a referendum that succeeded in passing that now they are going to basically completely get rid of the post-Soviet standard and now welcome back in nuclear weapons that belong to Russia in their borders, just putting the, nuclear stores that Russia has even closer to Western Europe and even closer to other NATO allies. So again, a pretty major escalation if they follow through on this. And also we had this escalation that Belarus may be about to send its own troops into this war, okay, which would be, again, another massive escalation. But this is, of course, coming from U.S. officials, so always be skeptical with everything that the State Department has to say. But I think this does kind of line up with everything that we've seen leading up to this. Again, they've been doing the large-scale military exercises with Russia. It wouldn't be all that surprising if they did join this offensive, but again, significant escalations that are pretty terrifying considering that we are talking about the prospects of nuclear war. And this is also coming at a time where Ukraine had basically diplomats or representatives go to meet with Russian representatives on the counter side up near the Belarusian border. And honestly, as you can see here, even President Zelensky of Ukraine is saying that he doesn't think that these talks are going to lead to anything. And basically that's because you have these two sides that are coming together that are not not only engaged in a full-scale, all-out hot war right now, but also the goals that they have, the red lines that they have drawn in the sand for their demands are completely clashing with each other. So it would be extremely surprising if this did lead to any actual peace negotiations. I'm hopeful, but essentially you have Russians on the one side that are demanding the complete overthrow of the current government in Ukraine. They don't want to make virtually any concessions on that front. They've called for the complete demilitarization of Ukraine, which would absolutely never happen for pretty obvious reasons. You are currently attacking this country, so obviously they would never be willing to give up their weapons, let alone, give up the current Kiev government that has been in power for years there. But then you have the Ukrainians on the other side who are essentially calling for Russia to do a full-scale retreat all the way past the Donbass region. And, these two sides are not going to come together in any meaningful capacity right now, it seems, unfortunately. But then we get to what the actual actions from the West have been taking here, basically. So we have escalation from Russia. We also have, in many different ways, escalation from NATO and escalation from Western allies. So this is just the latest on that. They say, since Moscow launched its war on Ukraine 4 days ago, the Biden administration, the United Kingdom, the European Union's member nations, and other U.S. allies have provided increased military aid to Kiev and imposed hard-hitting financial sanctions on Russia, including freezing the assets of Putin and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And also NATO on Friday activated parts, I covered this in a different story, parts of its response force for the first time in history. And on Sunday, in another pair of historic firsts, the EU agreed to ship arms to Ukraine and banned all Russian aircraft, including not only the country's airlines, but also Russian chartered private jets from European skies. Those decisions followed commitments made by several individual countries, including President Joe Biden's authorization of an additional $350 million worth of military equipment for Ukraine, and also Germany's moves to send weapons to Kiev and boost military spending. So weapons coming from all over the fucking European continent flooding into Kiev and Ukraine right now. They say on the economic front, the US, UK, and EU intensified sanctions against Russia, agreeing on Saturday to block selected banks from the SWIFT global financial communication system, which is something that Putin essentially said before would have been a red line that he considered an act of war, which moves money around more than 11,000 banks and other financial institutions worldwide. And finally, they say, in addition, leaders in the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Commission took steps to impose restrictive measures on Russia's central bank, targeting an estimated $640 billion in foreign exchange reserves that the Kremlin may soon be forced to rely on to support its currency, which some analysts fear will crash in value amid Western sanctions. And it absolutely has crashed by like roughly 40% the last time that I checked it. So you have this essentially dangerous spiral that is, I think, fully displayed here by Adam Tooze, who's a historian from Columbia University. He basically points out the spiral that we seem to be in now. He says, we are truly in a dangerous spiral. Brave Ukrainian resistance frustrates Russian attack. Kiev refuses humiliating negotiations. Russia about to ramp up destructiveness of the attack. So we've seen them using, more indiscriminate bombings recently in the last couple of days in large metropolitan areas. And, the civilian casualties are starting to really add up now. NATO members rushing weapons to Ukraine. EU and US announced major sanctions. What is Russia's next move? So again, that's basically the spiral that we have right now. We have, EU, US, NATO allies who are coming together, basically deploying almost the entire package of sanctions that they could have possibly gone with. The SWIFT sanctions were known as like the nuclear option, although they are implementing some caveats and loopholes essentially for certain sectors of the Russian economy. So it's not the all-out nuclear option, but it's basically the nuclear option when it comes to economic sanctions, which in many ways have even more damages than war itself in many cases. You can see this in countries like Venezuela, in Iran, in plenty of other countries that the United States and the global economic system has employed full-scale sanctions on. Usually they don't actually work in disposing of authoritarian governments. Usually they just harm civilian populations. And when you're talking about another nuclear armed superpower, it's pretty important to understand that when it comes to all of these negotiations, when it comes to potential peace talks, that the person who's sitting on the other end of the table with you has a finger on the nuclear weapons, right? Has a finger on the nuclear buttons, and you don't want it to spiral to that point. So None of this is to excuse Vladimir Putin's actions. Of course, he is a violent imperial aggressor. That's very obvious. But right now, really the main priority is averting all-out nuclear war, averting some confrontation between NATO and Russia, or the US and Russia. And I mean, any of the things that I just listed to you, the economic sanctions, the ramping up of the funneling of weapons from essentially every Western European country into Ukraine. I'm not making a moral judgment on whether or not those are good things or bad things. I think Ukrainians have every right to defend their territory. They have every right, especially average civilians, to defend their communities. That's perfectly fine. I obviously don't support giving weapons to people like the Azov Battalion or any Nazi coalitions that are within Ukraine, but the overarching message of allowing for them to defend themselves, 100% in support of that. But I definitely don't support any sanctions packages that are going to inflict suffering on Russian civilians who don't even support this war in the first place. So we're really having to try to walk this line here, trying to walk the line between what would Putin even consider to be an act of war. It seems like we've pretty much almost, if not already, crossed a lot of those lines, and it's yet to be seen where this goes from here, because this is pretty much as much of a dangerous spiral as you could possibly ask for. I mean, I'm not trying to be using fear tactics or anything like that, but we are literally right now closer to the prospects of an actual nuclear war between the United States and Russia than we have been in decades. So pretty terrifying, and you just hope that some cooler heads prevail in this situation, and we can start the de-escalation process instead of just this constant tit-for-tat back and forth escalation that we really don't know where it could go.